Hello, everybody. Welcome to the next edition of We Are All in This Together. And thank you so much for joining us. And we're really pleased today to have Anastasia Lintner from Lintner Law joining us. And of course, our host, Eugenia, who's going to help us with the housekeeping rules.
Sorry,
So
just going to be flipping. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our fourth webinar in our webinar series. If you are new to our webinar series, welcome. Just a few housekeeping things. If you're just joining us now via the computer, your video and microphone should be muted. And if you're listening through the phone, can you just please make sure that your microphone is muted so that we reduce any background noise we might experience. Today, we have a very special guest with us, Anastasia Lintner. Janet and Anna will be speaking for about 12 to 15 minutes each, and then we're going to have about 15 minutes towards the end for question and answers. If you have a question, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A box. It should be at the bottom of your screen. I will be monitoring all these questions. However, if you have a burning question during the presentation, I'm sure Janet and Anna would love to answer them, so please feel free to pop them in the box and I will be on the lookout for them. At the end of this webinar, please feel free to complete our survey. Let us know how we're doing. And it's also a chance to sign up and receive our Native Wildflower Ontario seed mix. That's it. Thank you.
very nice. I'm going to plant some of those actually very shortly as soon as I dig out the patch in the front yard. So once again, thanks very much. And I'm going to speak about 10 or 15 minutes, but it's going to be more of a bit of a reminder of some of the ground that we've covered. And then I'm going to give us a brief peek into the EU Green New Deal. So this is all about looking ahead and starting to think about how do we deal with the post-COVID and how do we recover from that, and what can Canada do that might be different from where we've been before, and how we could even take advantage of some of the things that we've done before and make them even better. So today is the blue-green, and we're actually going to be talking about the blue part more than the green part today. So next slide, please, Eugenia. To give you a little bit of background on us, we are the Wildlands League. We've been around since 1968, and our job is to protect nature. And we've been doing that for over 50 years. And we have an incredible team, and we work on projects across the country. Thank you. Next slide. So this is actually a really great picture. It's one of my favorites. It's from one of our Paddle the Rouge events that we do on an annual basis. This year, of course, we're going to be doing a virtual one, and you'll hear more about that shortly, but that's a teaser. But this is what it looks like to get out and paddle in an urban park. This is one of our youth that came out to get a paddling lesson, and Anna in the background, who is helping provide some safety, it looks like. Anyway, so the concept that we've been talking about over the last few weeks is really this idea of how can you take a landscape level look at southern Canada, where you've potentially got the most damage in terms of what's happened to the environment, and start to think about how do you rebuild, and doing so at a landscape level. So it really follows three basic things, which is protect the remnants that you have left, connect those, and then create restoration all along that footprint. Next slide, please. At this level, what it means is about putting these puzzle pieces together. So we have, Toronto's a really great example where we have a new national urban park in Rouge National Urban Park. There's an ability to restore, so they're working on restoring the Meadoway, and then thinking about how green infrastructure may connect into that and actually create even more value, and then reaching out to the rural landscape and working with rural landowners. Maybe it's farmers, maybe it's woodlot owners. It could even be industrial owners, and thinking about how do we actually do restoration and connectivity projects that can reach across all these puzzle pieces. Go ahead. And that will eventually create a network of nature. So all of these puzzle pieces bring you together at this sort of landscape level thinking and creating this network. Next slide, please. That's the theory underpinning this. And so we've worked, for example, on Rouge National Urban Park and getting that protected. Next slide. And how can you actually grow or build green infrastructure, making sure that you're addressing the waterways That's a really big important piece, and we'll go into more detail on that. Next slide. And restoration projects, and those could be anything from planting wildflower seeds in your garden and creating avian connectivity and finding ways that we can rebuild nature in southern Canada. Next slide. It could even be planting native species along roadways in subdivisions. Next slide. And of course, we had a really great webinar with Laura Ellis from Alice, talking about how farmers and farms can contribute to this sort of landscape level thinking, and contemplating just all the various ways that farms and farmers can contribute on nature. Next slide. So here's the preview. I don't know if anybody else has taken the time to look at the EU biodiversity strategy, and they just announced this and recommitted to some of this, but its design is meant to be thinking about the entire European Union and thinking about how will they advance on nature. And this is some of the setups here. As I don't need you to read the whole thing, and I'm certainly not going to read the whole thing to you, but it's just the idea that at the top there that climate change and biodiversity are connected, and that they are interconnected, and that it's time to fix their relationship with nature. The other piece here is that that we're still losing nature, that the global population of wild species has fallen by over 60% in the last 40 years, and that there are currently 1 million species at risk of extinction. So their climate crisis and biodiversity loss are interdependent, and they exacerbate each other. And it's this idea that we can actually tackle both of those by restoring our forests, our soils, our wetlands, and creating more green spaces in cities. And in fact, I would say Canada has the benefit of being able to even protect natural remnants still in some of our cities. We talked in an earlier presentation about Ojibwe shores and connecting the various green pieces there into a new national urban park in Windsor. Next slide. So for the EU, they have a commitment to protect 30% of the land in Europe and 30% of the seas. So similar to Canada, we have a 30 by 30. We actually have a 25 by 25 and a 30 by 30 commitment, 30% by 2030 and 25 by 25. And it's this idea that you're really trying to take care of all the ecosystems. They've got a variety of other programs that in some ways we're either ahead or we're just getting on board with. They've got a planting of 3 billion trees. I'd like for our conversation today, restoring at least 25,000 kilometers of EU rivers to free-flowing state. I thought that was a very interesting piece in there, certainly thinking about where we're going in our discussion today. Next slide. So it's about putting all of these pieces together at this sort of one level of thinking, and also starting to think about what are the various jobs that get generated as part of a restoration economy. Next slide. We've been thinking of this, again, as I said, from a Southern Canada lens. We're doing pilot projects specifically in the parts of Southern Ontario, like with Windsor, in the Toronto region, and then thinking about how London and the connectivity might work there. But we've also been talking to groups, as you know, if you've attended the webinars across Canada, to think about how do you create connectivity from Birch Cove Lakes, which is in Halifax. How do you create connectivity out from cities like Edmonton and Calgary and reach out to the rural landscape? So we really want to see this as an entire Canadian strategy, while we're focused on thinking through the lens of Southern Ontario, which is the biodiversity hotspot for Canada, the most endangered species here. Next slide. So this is just a brief summary that all these kinds of jobs would be impacted if we had an all of Canada or a whole of government approach. You've got engineers and hydrologists, the folks who drive the excavation equipment, construction, planting ecologists in the green infrastructure box. You've got people who will be working on the restoration piece in the bottom right, you know, restoring wetlands, growing wildlife, reintroduction of wildlife, naturalizing areas, tree planting, obviously. But you've also got to do the design and actually grow the trees to get to that stage. And then there's all the facilitation, et cetera. So there's a number of jobs that would be sort of implicated in the implementation of this. On the rural landscape, there are farmers and woodlot owners and rural landowners and indigenous, even private land acquisition. We've seen when we started to look at the central Ontario piece, which is really connecting rural to rural and doing all different kinds of landowner piece puzzles there. You had everything from private landowners to private land acquisition for some of our folks who run land trusts. In the near urban protection, that's ecologist restoration. We're just talking to Omar, and we're going to have him on at a later webinar to talk about the creation of Rouge National Urban Park. And somewhere over 200 jobs were created just because we were doing Rouge National Urban Park and doing all this restoration. And many farmers participated in this, and they have an indigenous circle. I think it's 9 different indigenous nations who are participating in that. Next slide. So what we're really looking at is how we can contribute on all different kinds of ways. It's about the green infrastructure being the connective tissue, near urban protection, protecting those remnants of natural areas that you have left. At the rural level, you can have programs like ALICE and grasslands projects in Saskatchewan. CWS is just the federal government doing some of their endangered species work. Rural landowners doing stewardship. In the restoration bucket or puzzle piece, you have private land and municipal land with businesses. The Meadoway project, for example, is a great piece. It could even be butterfly gardens on school property or wildflower gardens in your backyard, because again, that creates some of the avian and insect connectivity that we need. Next piece. So it provides all of these other co-benefits, which is healing, access to nature, and a bit of a social justice as well. Many communities, certainly in the GTA, are not advantaged enough to be able to go out and get out of the city, but having nature close to their backyards allows every community to be able to access nature. If you can get to it on the TTC, then you can get to nature, or even your bike. And obviously jobs, we're promoting this as a concept for recovery and biodiversity and all the benefits for species, and the benefits in terms of climate, in terms of increasing our resilience to ice storms, managing drought and flood events, which also will increase or decrease, insurance rates and help out municipalities just in terms of the costs for repair and damage that these kinds of events take their toll on a city budget. Next slide. And if you're lucky enough to create this, you end up here. You end up being able to kayak in your favorite new National Urban Park. That's me at Rouge National Urban Park. I think it's on Canada Day, actually. And my intention is to get back out on the water very, very soon. I think that's it for me. So Eugenia, you can switch over now.
Okay. Anna, you can take over the screen.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me to have this conversation with you today. I'm really quite excited. I like to talk about these things, and I'd like to hear what people are thinking about too, and asking their questions, and see where we can end up. What I want to do today is sort of just share a little bit about the conundrums, the ideas for weaving water into the considerations. Janet's already touched on a few ways in which water is weaving into the conversation around the restoration economy. And I've seen at least one research group really start to bring it together in the consideration of the energy, water, and food nexus, and this idea of sort of co-creating, co-solving a number of our issues all at the same time. And as I go through my little talk, I have a practice called Lintner Law, and we provide strategic advice around the legal systems, the Canadian legal system, and analysis and assistance in understanding public policy and how to create it in favor of sustainability and reconciliation. And I like to do a lot of outreach and talk to people, educate and engage with how the systems can work better, how they currently work, any kinds of questions you might have. And I'm a lawyer, but what I say today is not legal advice. If you need legal advice on a particular issue, I encourage you to reach out to myself or other lawyers with the expertise you need. And I'm going to focus on the Canadian policy framework, the settler policy framework. And just to transition of us about thinking about this a little bit, I'm going to talk about first an Indigenous law or an Indigenous legal agreement that applies where I currently reside, which is in what's now called Kingston, Ontario. If you haven't seen this before, this is the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. This treaty is, what I know about it is that, well, first of all, it predates Confederation. And what I know about it is that it is a mostly white record of an agreement, which suggests it's one that means it was brought in peace. And the blue circle in the center is the dish. And the idea that the Haudenosaunee brought this agreement of peace to the Anishinaabe in this part of the Great Lakes Basin, as we now call it, was about there's just one dish. And we need to share this space together. And some of the principles that come out of that are you take what you need and you make sure there's enough left for others, for future generations. And it's a sort of practice rules from the Indigenous legal tradition about how we're going to be in and working within and around nature. And I think it resonates deeply with me, but it also resonates with some of the legal principles that we have currently in Canadian public policy. And it provides some of the context for what I'd like to talk about today. And in acknowledging the territories I'm on, I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the burden, the weight of this moment that we're in. It's unprecedented to be in this situation of a global pandemic, the conflict and racial bias showing up in ways that is very hard to witness, and climate change, the sick mass extinction. I have to sort of grin. If you think about it much, I think it could paralyze you, and you wouldn't to step forward into what is, I think, the opportunity. And in this crisis, multiple crises all hitting us at the same time, I think there is a lot to learn, and there's a lot to discover, and there's a lot to teach us about how we could build back better as the basis for what opportunity, what this moment of transformation could look like. So the opportunity, as we shift from managing ourselves within a crisis situation to how we're going to set our policies and spending and investments in the future, some of the words that come to mind for me are recovery, resilience, reconciliation. And it reminded me of this report of the Environmental Commissioner, then Environmental Commissioner Gord Miller, in fall in 2009, when he was writing the foreword or the introduction to this report, the annual report of the Commissioner's Office, the theme bringing forward resilience into a number of opportunities for building resilience was in the midst of a financial crisis. And so it's not the first time that we've talked about resilience as an opportunity for thinking our policies through the lens of resilience, but it's thinking about it now in this context. I see really big ideas could form the basis of transformation. And in resilience, when we think about resilience and ecosystems and how they function, one of the things that ecosystems, in order to, sort of complex systems, their resilience is strengthened by their redundancy or duplication, if you like. In nature, we're looking at biodiversity as the way in which it helps keep those systems resilient. And if we think about it in human systems, one of the big water lessons we've had in recent times, now 20 years ago, it's hard to believe, but the Walkerton water tragedy and the resulting legacy of what we learned about our drinking water systems. And if there's anybody listening who's too young to know about this tragedy, 20 years ago in May, one of the local activists, Bruce Davidson, describes it this way: a limping drinking water system was made lethal. And a series of events that led to E. coli getting into the drinking water system and people becoming sick and some dying. And then looking at the systems and deciding we need to build resilience into it by making sure there's what's called a multi-barrier approach, that we're looking at protecting drinking water at all kinds of different points in the sequence, from taking it from the source to getting it to your tap, in order to allow that if one of them isn't working as best as it could, our drinking water is still going to be safe. And I think that's a really important lesson for thinking about as we make our decisions and build our policies. We want to be, we want to create redundancy where it's important for resilience. And then if we need to, cut things and create efficiencies, that's done in ways that still are thinking about, people first and how we ensure and safeguard health, healthy systems, healthy ecosystems, healthy people. These all go hand in glove. So some of the challenges I see are, there's lots of challenges. And one of them is that certainly in the past, and less so now, but this idea of being separate from nature, that we have an economic system that we take from nature, we make things, and then we dispose, we consume, and then we dispose. That linear thinking means that we aren't really ensuring that as we make those choices, we are both creating systems that are resilient from ecosystem perspective and thinking about how we're nested, or how everything we do has an impact on nature, but then also back on ourselves. So if we're looking at environmental health, for example, what are the things that we're putting into nature, into the water, say, that then get back into our systems and harm us? If we thinking on more of a circular basis or a circular economy, then we'd be thinking those things through and making sure that we're protecting people and the ecosystems. So a couple more things I'll say about this slide, that when we're talking about fragmentation or just looking at a single issue at a time, or looking at the idea of responsibility, we've tended to divide things up into buckets. Different ministries within a government, different ways of looking at water, planning for stormwater, planning for wastewater, planning for drinking water, when that might not be reflective of how we get to the best solutions. And on the responsibilities piece, we're talking about how in the Canadian Constitution, the division of power between the federal government, kind of list of head power, there's no, just that somebody's sort of overseeing how we interact with water. There's fisheries under the federal government, there's natural resources and local governance, provincial government. And so what we learned is that in interpreting our Constitution, the responsibility for inland waters and as they flow into, say, the Great Lakes and then into the oceans, there's both federal and provincial responsibility. When there's shared responsibility, I think there's still great opportunity for collaboration and working together to make sure that the waters are safeguarded. But then there's also the challenge of things that may be slipping through the cracks as those areas of authority are delineated. And the final thing I want to say about this slide before we shift to a little bit of interaction with you is the challenge of sort of who is vulnerable and how we define vulnerable communities. Vulnerabilities are very dynamic and they change, and we generally know that environmental harms fall disproportionately on low income and other disadvantaged communities. But we can see that sometimes that evolves, and who is vulnerable. If we take the COVID situation, who is vulnerable to the potential that the disease will harm them is slightly different than the sort of who is vulnerable as a result of everything we have to do in this situation. And if we tell people they need to stay home and they need to wash their hands a lot, do they have a home? Can they stay home? Are they then separated from the opportunity for mental health and healing of nature? And all of this go along with that. Do they have water that they're washing their hands at all the time? So one of the things we need to have in mind is that planning, thinking about those vulnerabilities, they're not fixed and they're not static, which is a huge challenge. But now I want to switch from the weight of the world and the challenges we face into a bit of an interactive exercise with our participants. And I'm going to just put up the fact that it is a poll, but Eugenia is going to launch it for us. And you can either on a separate device that you might have with you, or if you want to use, if you're on the laptop and you want to use your same device, you just need to go to this website, menti.com, www.menti.com. And at the top of that website, you put in a code. It's 806524. And then you can answer this question. What word or phrase comes to mind when you think of water? You can submit lots of words. You can submit a little phrase, but you can submit more than once. And as I'm thinking about it, one of the images that Janet showed you was that when we're looking at nature, there's going to be water. One of the areas that we know we need to protect and restore are wetlands, and those are the combinations of the land and the vegetation, and also the water and the aquatic species and all of the things that go with it. So there's lots of integration between how water moves, a drop of water from the headlands or the headwaters, and flows surface water or groundwater through a watershed into a bigger river, bigger lake, and then off out into the ocean. It's a big cycle, and I think it's one of the things that we need to be keeping in mind. And I hope you're enjoying as much as I am watching this little word cloud as people rewords that it's part of there's different types of, and then there's some of the we're concerned about that we might not have that I like that I see the word power. Where is the power, but also it can create power. So great. We'll just let it, I'm enjoying it. So let it build for another couple of seconds. Okay, I think we'll stop it there. And then I'll just go back to my little presentation.
And just a quick time check, it's 12:30.
Thank you. So I alluded earlier to the fact that there's in the understanding of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, the kinds of legal principles teaching are the kinds of things that we have in our environmental law principles. And I've listed some of them here. I don't want to spend a bunch of time, like we could, you know, Janet and Eugenia know this. I could go on and teach you all about environmental law and the principles and what's important, but I wanted just to remind people that there are a number of these principles already within our systems, and an opportunity exists to shift them from sort of being our guiding principles or things we consider, or you know, a consideration that's kind of aside of other important priorities, to being more central, to being the lens by which we start to make decisions in a way that will shift us to being preventative and precautionary and reconciling our relationships, and also thinking about these environmental justice and intergenerational equity frames. So some of the things I've been thinking about of how we can go about doing this is very, you know, you've heard most of it if you've been on the other webinars, and you've heard Janet talk. These are very much in line with the idea of the restoration economy, that we are talking about integration, so that we're thinking on what I call an ecologically relevant scale. Our political systems are not set up on the sort of kinds of scales that help us plan for or think through a watershed approach or an ecosystem-based approach, and we have the opportunity to be thinking about that. We have the opportunity to put our investments going forward into opportunities that are going to give us lots of different types of benefits. So when we're investing in gray infrastructure, as we call it, those types of investments, massively important when our gray infrastructure is falling apart. What I want to say about this is that they are often just for a purpose, so a pipe for a particular purpose. Whereas when we invest in green infrastructure, there are many benefits, co-benefits, multi-benefits that you get from making those investments. And to the extent that we have the opportunity to collaborate across governments, within governments, to figure out how to do some of these things. One of the stories I wanted to share was about being innovative in terms of what you're willing to try on. I used to live in Guelph, and I was honored to be on an advisory committee when they were going through the process of deciding how they were going to address growth in the community and the additional water needs that would come with it. And what was decided was that the cost per cubic meter of providing new water by building a pipeline was a known amount. And they decided they would try on any conservation measure that would cost the same or less than that. And experimented with trying on a bunch of different ways of incentivizing conservation, and didn't build a pipe. And that's sort of like thinking, what could we do? And then what things I think opportunity to there's really this is a really timely, important discussion. I thank Wildlands League for giving me the opportunity to say some things about it, and I will turn over to Eugenia and questions.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Anna and Janet, for your insight and your time. It's been great to hear from you. We have a couple of questions that people have sent in, and also for anyone that's listening right now, if you're interested in putting in a question, please submit them into the Q&A box now. But Anna and Janet, we have some questions right now if you're interested. So the first question is, are there any sources of funding for companies to carry out riparian ecological restoration projects?
Well, I'll just speak for Wildlands League. We don't tend to work in this space, but I would say that I do know that, for example, that Carolyn in Canada has been working on restoration, and they have, you know, I wouldn't say they have tons of money by any stretch, but they certainly are and I wouldn't approach them for money, but rather that they are the kinds of groups who work in this space and may know more about riparian funding projects. The other one that I would say is that they've been looking at alternative funding models, and so actually working at a community scale with a municipality and thinking through how do we actually do the restoration projects and see this as an ecological benefit. And then they've started to engage a company around the idea of creating green bonds that essentially fund this work. And so I think that what we're pushing towards is we're starting to say, let's start to value these things, find different ways to create an economic opportunity so that we can actually attract more dollars. I would also say that there might be some overlap with where the federal government works on endangered species in some hotspots, and then you may have municipal funding that might work as well. And we're hoping that by doing new national urban parks that there will be funding associated with doing restoration and repair work as part of that. But in all honesty, I couldn't tell you where to go today to go and get funding. You might check with your municipalities or other places that you could start to uncover that, but it's not an area that we're experts in. Anastasia, do you have any insight?
Well, yeah, I was just thinking that there's, I don't know the sort of where this particular investment in ecological riparian restoration might happen, but that's what I kind of thought along similar lines, that there are both innovative ways to get involved in the community to both advocate for green infrastructure and then the means by which that community is going to fund it through innovative methods like green bonds and so on, but also pairing up with communities that are trying to figure these things out as well. And I think you're right. I think this is going to evolve. The green infrastructure communities of practice is developing, you know, messages around where are the solutions that have worked and opportunities, and then learning about the projects and the funding that can go along with doing more and more and more as we go forward. Yeah, so again, don't have the perfect answer, but yeah. I think there's, I'm happy to answer if somebody is listening and wants to ask those questions. I can respond by email with some of the ideas of where to start looking.
Yeah, Dave Pierce works at Wildlands League, and he's put something in the chat that is helpful, which is around the Nature Conservancy and partnership programs under their Natural Heritage Conservation Program, and they have some money for restoration. So maybe that's a very specific one for folks to go and look at. But I would recommend we need to broaden this as well. Thanks, Dave.
Great. We also have another question. What do you consider the largest limitation of Ontario's flooding strategy? So I know that both of you talked a little bit about that. How could these limitations be improved to positively influence conservation?
Oh, Stacey, I'm going to let you go first.
Yeah, so I didn't review Ontario's flooding strategy today. So I don't know off the top of my head its limitations or its benefits. But what I can say is that the opportunity along is we start.
Sorry, Anna, you're breaking up a little bit there. Could you just repeat what you just said?
If ends
yeah. Sorry, Anastasia, yeah, you're breaking up. So I think I'm just going to go to the short, is that the flooding strategy should inform any sort of landscape level considerations, and the specifics around the flooding strategy we have not looked into yet. I mean, at this level, what we're trying to do is create an overall momentum to think about Southern Canada as having an actual strategy around a landscape level management of it, and how do you take care of it. And flooding is absolutely integral to that, and how can it actually inform what you do and help guide it. So that's the best that I can say. But yeah, Anastasia, you've been breaking up a little bit on the
Sorry.
connection, so that's okay.
Yeah, of course my internet is unstable. Just when I wanted to tell you something really important about another little story about how we have been transitioning our planning. So when I was at the University of Guelph and I was looking at doing my postgraduate work and figuring out sort of how these systems work together, I actually got the opportunity to take a hydrology course. It was outside of my discipline into hydrology. And I just remember so vividly the professor saying, you know, there was a period of time where we addressed flooding by building these massive, straight, linear, really deep with big walls conveyances. And now we've learned that what we really need to do is return them to winding little streams and meandering, because that's actually the best way to slow down water and to prevent flooding. So it's that, like, let's be thinking about it more from that, like, how can we take the landscape, look at the landscape and figure out how water can slow down, move more slowly through the system so that it doesn't overwhelm us. And that's a big collective action problem rather than a individual, you know, property by property problem.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that sort of connects to, I guess that'll be our last question today. What can people do? What can we do at a household level to sort of address some of the issues that you've brought up today?
Well, maybe I'll just start with, I think that because we're thinking of it at a landscape level, we're thinking that every property has something to participate in. City of Toronto's had a disconnect your downspout program for a number of years, and that's because it actually allows the ground to do what it's supposed to do, which is to absorb and help control that and slow water down and be an absorption and a sponge. And the more that we actually plant native species, the better equipped the areas are able to deal with water and help both on flooding and drought. And I know for me, you know, we let any grass that we do have, we let it grow extra long so that it can be there to help during droughts. Its root system goes further and deeper. And so I think just thinking about how your backyard and how your management of your land is actually contributing to the overall health of that ecosystem, which is your neighborhood and the places in your backyard where you're living. And so finding a way, there's lots of different programs and city programs across the province, across Canada, that would be looking to actually figure out how you can contribute as a homeowner or as a renter in terms of mitigating flood and helping with drought. Anastasia?
I have nothing to add. I would have answered very similarly.
Okay, great. The other thing that I was going to say is that many communities, and we've just started to look into this because we're noticing our offices are based out of Toronto, and several of us live in the GTA, some in Guelph and Burlington and other places in Southern Ontario. But we're noticing that we've just seen a posting by the city asking for recovery suggestions. And so I would say to our audience that we're going to be putting together some suggestions for how municipalities and communities can be thinking about these very opportunities as they start to build recovery from COVID as municipalities and cities and places where you live. And so we're going to be putting that together and hopefully having it on our listserv. And so you should sign up for that and make sure that you receive our e-news. But we're trying to basically say now's the time for all of us to start reimagining and seeing these as opportunities. So that's what we hope to do, because communities are actively thinking about how do they rebuild and how do they reposition, and flood management and drought management to think of that as nature in aid of that. Okay, and that brings us to the end of our webinar. Janet,
All right.
Yeah, so thanks everybody for joining. The webinar will be available after the fact. And Anastasia, thank you so much for your participation and help in thinking this through. You're a vital voice in the province of Ontario, thinking through how all of the laws intersect and how we can think outside of our boxes in terms of strategy around policy and frameworks. And you're a great friend to Wildlands League, and I really appreciate you being on this webinar with us. Thank you so much. Thank you,
Thank
Eugene, as
you.
well.
Thank you.